Okay, so today I'm joined by Emanuel Hahn and Andrew Kung in New York. Good evening, guys. How's it going?
Good.
It's going well.
How are you?
Not bad. Just Thursday morning in Hong Kong. Got the whole office to myself. Can't complain.
Nice.
So just to jump right in here, could you tell, the people listening who you guys are, where you're from, and what you do?
Go for it, Emmanuel.
Okay. So my name is Emanuel Hahn. I'm currently a commercial photographer in Brooklyn, New York. My quick background is I grew up in a couple of countries in Asia, so Singapore, Cambodia, South Korea. My parents are from South Korea. And I moved to the States for college. I went to NYU for business school in 2010, graduated 2014. Worked in the tech startup space for about 2 years before leaving that world behind to become a freelance photographer full time. And I've been working as a commercial photographer for 2 years now.
Awesome. And Andrew?
Yep, great. So my name's Andrew. I was born and raised in San Francisco. And like Emmanuel, I also went to undergrad business school. Went to school right across the bay in Berkeley. And after Berkeley, I also worked in the tech world. So I worked at LinkedIn for about 3.5 years doing strategy and analytics before making the jump to full-time freelance photography. So I've now been in New York for about 2 years and have done photography for just 1 year. I actually just hit my 1 year mark this month. So I've been doing a lot of commercial kind of editorial type shoots here in New York City.
Cool. Well, I guess your guys' most recent project, the Mississippi Delta Chinese, would fall into that category. So I was wondering if you guys could tell me just a little bit more about what that project is, kind of in a nutshell.
I can talk about the project, and then maybe for the later questions, Andrew can go over the process. So the project, the Mississippi Delta Chinese is an audiovisual narrative experience. And so what that means is it's a storytelling effort that centers around this Chinese community in the Mississippi Delta. And for background, these Chinese have lived in the Mississippi Delta for over 100 years. There is a lot of kind of historical evidence proving that the Chinese immigrated to this area from even before the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, and a lot of them came as laborers. And over time, this community grew. And we sort of discovered about their existence and thought it was such an interesting community because people tend not to associate Chinese people or just Asian Americans in general to be living in the rural South. And the Mississippi Delta is sort of this quintessential area that people think of when they think of the rural South. So the project itself, the way it's laid out, the website features photography and an audio component that tells the stories of currently, I think, 7 different people in the Mississippi Delta. And it kind of takes a first-person view on what it's like to live in the Delta. Some of them are more historical, some of them are more anecdotal, but they all kind of explain what being Chinese means living in the Mississippi Delta.
So just for people who aren't American, myself included, what region is the Mississippi Delta? What states are in there?
So the Mississippi Delta kind of refers to this general area where the Mississippi River runs through. And so there are a bunch of states that the river goes through. I don't think I can remember all of those states, but Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana. These are basically a bunch of states that have the Mississippi River running through it, and a lot of the economy and activity in those areas are agricultural and depend on the river for whatever is produced there.
Okay, I see. So I'm just referencing your guys' project website, the summary on there, and basically you guys were trying to re-examine and maybe even challenge some of these existing narratives about Asian Americans. So I'm curious, could you tell me a little more about what made you guys decide to just leave New York and go into the Delta?
Yeah, I'm sure I can answer that one. So I think it all started at Emanuel's apartment. We were talking more about personal projects that we wanted to explore because we've been doing more commercial work with larger brands. And so we wanted to take on a deeper meaning to the projects that we were working on. And as Asian American photographers, we were very intrigued about kind of looping in our ethnic backgrounds to actually our craft of photography. And so I brought up to Emanuel and I said, oh, like my parents met in North Carolina. My dad was stationed in the Army and my mom went to school in South Carolina. And I thought that was interesting as Asians, especially in the previous generation, how that was kind of acclimating to the South and being kind of a minority group. And as I brought this up, I also said, oh man, I wonder how it's like to actually shoot the southern rural landscapes. As a photographer, that would be pretty amazing. And so as I brought this up, Emanuel kind of almost connected the dots together. And he was like, oh, what if we did a dual project together on Asian Americans in the deep rural South? And so as we kind of simmered on that idea, we were like, oh, well, let's look at all the states that we can kind of potentially explore. And so we basically found a bunch of Asian American organizations in different states, from Atlanta to Alabama to Mississippi. And I think what kind of narrowed it down to the Mississippi Delta was we saw this one NPR article on this very tight-knit community in the Delta. And what helped propel that was, as we started doing all this outreach, one person from an organization or association, Asian American Association in Mississippi, reached out and said, hey, I know this girl named Frida Kwan and this guy named Gilroy Chow, and I can potentially introduce you to them. And so as she introduced us to Gilroy and Frida, we basically started building this kind of relationship with them where they got very bought into the idea of our project. And they became then our champions of the project, where they basically introduced us to almost 20 people in the community. And so from that point on, it was basically just kind of building that relationship and kind of building that trust. Because especially as Asian Americans in a area that is not too diverse, for outsiders to come in, they have a certain level of skepticism almost when it comes to outsiders coming in and trying to tell their story.
What kind of tension is that? Like, what kind of suspicion is there? Because you guys are both Asian American yourselves. I just want to know what kind of points of tension there could be.
Yeah, I think it was two things. I think one is that previously there was a lady and multiple, I think, instances where people in the more documentary field, producing more documentary videos or pieces on the community, have painted the community in a very kind of negative light, and maybe not kind of piecing or together the Mississippi Delta Chinese as people who necessarily contributed to the society or to their communities. And so that happened a few different times.
When you say negative, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, Emanuel, do you want to expand a little bit on the?
Yeah, I think so. With this specific documentary filmmaker, they had an agenda in mind, and they kind of portrayed these Mississippi Chinese as kind of like backwards, like poor. A lot of them were operating grocery stores, so like not doing very well. And initially, the community had welcomed this kind of like documentary producer because they thought it was going to be something that was, beneficial to the community. But it ended up kind of like hurting them, and that the documentary filmmaker just wanted to kind of portray the Chinese living there in this very kind of like negative light, where they were kind of like a drain to society, a burden to society. They weren't like working in fields that were prestigious. And so a lot of people ended up becoming very wary. And so when we reached out to them, a lot of them were asking us, what is your agenda? What are you trying to do with these photos? And another question being like, are you trying to make money off of like our stories? And I think the other kind of the other factor to consider was that we were warned by people also that people in the rural South tend to just be more suspicious of people who are coming from outside. And I think you can certainly understand from their perspective, you have just like two city boys showing up claiming that they want to do a story. I think it's only natural that they would have their suspicions. They really wanted to know like what we were trying to do, how we were trying to tell their story. And like kind of like what the end product would be. They would ask us, are you trying to put it up in a gallery? What are you trying to do? And I think a lot of the times we had to speak to them, just explaining to them that we had a personal stake in these stories, that we were not trying to portray them in any like agenda that we had, but more just kind of like taking what they were telling us at face value and trying to tell a really good story. And so like I guess this is jumping the gun a little bit, but we kind of like finished the project and we sent it over to two of them to view. And one of the things that they responded with was like, hey, you guys portrayed us really fairly and really objectively, and we're really thankful for that. And so I think going into the project, we knew we weren't trying to kind of like fit a narrative to them. I think it was more of like a discovery process where we wanted to go there and just sit down with them and talk to them for like an hour and really understand what their experiences were like.
That's actually a really good point you bring up about like city people coming into the countryside. And I'd like to talk about that later. But looking at your website and I look at the photos, they're really, really well done in the sense they're down to earth and they're super honest. I just want to know how you guys went about achieving that aesthetic.
I think it's two parts. I think from sort of like a tools perspective, like what we chose to shoot the project in, we very early on decided that we wanted to shoot the entire project on film and not on digital. And one of the reasons is just that we feel like film has this very kind of classic looking feel to it. And it's also kind of not really beholden by trends necessarily, where if you choose a certain film stock, then it's going to kind of look like that forever. And it's also film stock that people have used in the past. So there's this kind of element of continuity. And I think from a documentary perspective, we didn't want these images to be like too trendy and then fall out of trend a couple of years down the line. So we started off with that mentality of like, let's shoot everything on medium format and 35 millimeter film. Let's kind of shoot on Kodak Portra 400 so that we can keep the look consistent. And so that was more the decision-making process for the tools that we used. But I think in terms of approaching the actual shooting process, we made it a point to kind of like talk to these people first for an hour or 2 hours if possible, depending on the time that was available to us. And I think that was really important because even though we had talked to all these people on the phone before we went down to the Delta, I think it was just very important to build that rapport in real life and just really hear their stories. And, everyone that we met, they were like really friendly from the beginning, but at the end of our hour-long conversation, they were just kind of at a different level of openness. I think they felt good that they could share their stories with us. And once they had shared their story with us, they were just kind of like more eager to be willing. And so once that barrier was broken, I think it was just really easy to kind of take their portraits, whether it's giving direction and them just feeling more comfortable to do what we told them to do. And then for some of the other portraits, we kind of went to places that were very comfortable to these people. So a lot of the portraits are actually taken at their homes, and people usually feel more comfortable at home and they're just wearing whatever they would wear on a daily basis. We didn't try to like put too much production into it so that people felt comfortable where they were. For some of them, we went to like their workplace. So for example, Taylor is a farmer, or not really a farmer. His family is a family of farmers, but he works at the Department of Agriculture. And so one of his duties is to kind of like go around all these different cotton fields and to examine kind of like the irrigation system. So when we were kind of driving around, going to all these cotton fields, it was an environment that he was very comfortable in. And he actually like wanted to teach us things because like that's what he did. And I think because of that element, we were able to open him up where we weren't telling him to do anything necessarily, but he was just kind of like leading the way and he was kind of like explaining things to us. And as we took photos of him, I think it just became that they were really natural and that we didn't have to like direct them too much. So yeah, I think that that's kind of the biggest thing. And Andrew, if you have anything else to add to that.
Yeah, I think one thing that just wanted to emphasize was that I think the relationship and kind of trust building process started fairly on in those initial kind of phone conversations that we had with these people. Because going in, a lot of the people will be upfront and saying that, oh, like, what do you want to talk about? Like, what do you want to know? What kind of questions should I prepare for? Like, what do you guys want to do with this project? So I think being as kind of open and honest with our entire process started that relationship building piece. And so what we wanted to emphasize going into each interaction with the people that we met up with was that we wanted to chat with them for at least an hour, have them tell us about their story and how they kind of ended up in the Mississippi Delta. And as we started building this very kind of organic and authentic relationship, I think it allowed for a certain level of intimacy when it came to the portraits. It allowed us a certain level of comfort as we are, walking around their home or walking in their back porch, to be able to, as they're telling certain stories, to be able to kind of naturally integrate a portrait as they're speaking, or maybe taking a quick pause and taking a photo. I think that made it a lot more seamless and kind of effortless. And it wasn't as kind of structured as, okay, let's chat here for an hour and then let's walk around now and then let's take these 10 photos. I think it was kind of organized into a very seamless experience, which I think made for a very intimate kind of portrait series.
For sure. By the looks of it, you guys definitely invested into the trust building process. And I understand you guys shot this in October of 2017. Now, was that the whole month? Or I'm just wondering because it seems like you guys have shot over several cities. I was wondering how you guys kind of went about producing that, like logistically.
Yeah, so I think our kind of organization or our structure was so like leading up to that, I would say previous 3 months or so was spent kind of almost organizing and producing the shoot, waiting for people to respond, and kind of coordinating a calendar of what our shooting schedule was going to be like, because we were only there for a little over a week. So it wasn't like, we had tons of time once we're there to explore and really get into it. Just because Emanuel had to travel, we had a few shoots booked. And so prior to going, we had basically a week block. And with that 1 week block, we had to map out geographically where all the people were along the Delta. And now they're kind of like certain people are spread out along Mississippi. So we had to make sure all our driving routes were fairly optimal. And so for the whole 7-day span, we basically mapped out, I think, 3 to 4 interviews per day. And we also allowed room to shoot more landscapes of the South, because I think that really adds to the context of our story. And so over a course of a week, we basically optimized our route to minimize the amount of driving. And so so as I mentioned before, having 3 or 4 interviews a day and kind of budgeting in time for things like, oh, they invited us to dinner, so we have another kind of intimate session with these guys, or someone is treating us to lunch. And I think what we quickly realized is that the Southern hospitality is very real. As soon as we kind of broke down those barriers, and as soon as we kind of built that trust, people opened us with very open arms and almost treated us as if we were family, or if we were kind of their grandchildren. And so I think that was a combination of that trust building and also that kind of Southern hospitality.
Southern hospitality, it's a real thing, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely.
It's real.
It's very real.
So aside from this initial challenge of building a relationship with that community, were there any other sorts of hurdles that you guys encountered while producing Mississippi Delta Chinese?
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to think now if there were any like significant challenges. I think like we probably underestimated how far all these like cities and towns are. Like on Google Maps, we would just think like, oh, it'll be like half an hour to an hour. But then when we got there, it's actually like an hour to 2 hours. And so I think it's just like getting there and like readjusting our expectations and making room for all those, or I guess building in the window of time for all that travel. I think the biggest challenge was just like logistical. And I think like Andrew and I were saying after the project that we should have had a producer with us or someone to just coordinate things for us. But I think in terms of challenges, like the biggest challenges were just logistical. And maybe like it was just trying to get as much information as we could in that limited time that we had. Sometimes we just wish we could have spent like an entire day with one subject because they could have told us about, you know, so many things that were going on in their lives, but we would just have to cut short the interview because we had to drive like 2 or 3 hours to the next person and we only had so much sunlight in a day. And I think like just making sure that we were doing these people justice in terms of the stories that they were telling us. We had to be kind of very targeted in the questioning that we gave out. You know, we would have loved to just kind of like hear everything, but with the limited amount of time, we just had to ask very specific questions that we wanted answers for. Every interview started out with like, hey, tell me about your history, tell me about your upbringing. Do you have any like interesting memories that come out from your childhood? And then as they spoke about their experiences, usually there would be threads that sort of came out that we would pull at. And a lot of the questions that we asked were kind of based on what identity or what their Chinese identity meant to them. And, you know, for a lot of them, they came of age in a time of segregation. So they were kind of like this weird like third group in between the blacks and the whites. And a lot of their ideas about being Chinese were very informed by that. On one hand, you know, just like with their families wanting their kids to go to school with the white kids and then coming back home where they would live with a majority in a majority black community because Asians were still not allowed to buy homes in predominantly white neighborhoods. And so hanging out with like black kids growing up and just kind of like still you know, acknowledging the fact that they're Chinese. So this kind of interesting tension, I think, of not really feeling like they belonged in any community, but at the same time having this kind of very small, tight-knit Chinese community that they could kind of be free in and express themselves in. So a lot of questions about Chinese identity, a lot of questions about if they faced any discrimination, which, you know, a lot of them did. It was only normal, I think, back then to be discriminated against. And then just kind of like what their lives were like through anecdotes, through family traditions that they created, or through like interesting things that the Chinese community did to kind of like preserve their culture. And one of it being this like annual dance that was organized by this group called the Lucky Seven, which would basically draw a huge crowd of Chinese people from not just the Mississippi, but from like Arkansas, Alabama, Louisiana. And it was this like big deal where every year people would drive for miles to come to this dance. And that's where a lot of people met their future spouses. And so super interesting stories like that. And then some other people who like decided to become mayor of their town to like fix something that no one else would. Yeah, just kind of like a lot of inspiring stories like that.
I think we also wanted to tap into not just identity, but identity relative to geography. So like, what were some of their favorite things like growing up in the South? What do they love about the South? What do they hate about the South? And I think speaking about identity relative to that context, because I think that's what we are really interested, me and Emanuel, are as Asian Americans living in New York City, and me being from San Francisco, we're very used to the identity of Asian Americans in large urban cities. And that identity is very much so one of a model minority, kind of identity where, as Asian Americans, you work very hard, you go to a great school, you get a great paying job, either as a doctor or a lawyer, or you work in tech or in banking, and you kind of make it. But we wanted to tap into how that perspective was different in the South, and how you don't necessarily have to follow that path to make a contribution in your community and your society.
I totally agree with that. I think that's a kind of a recurring theme with Asian American communities, no matter where they reside. I want to ask you guys, what do you think is the biggest point of separation between Asian Americans living in urban areas versus rural areas?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the biggest difference is really just that the decisions that people make is influenced by their environment. And by that, I mean the kind of jobs that they can get, the kind of education that they will receive, the kind of people that they're surrounded by. It really kind of informs their identity and kind of like who they become. And I think like, as an example, a lot of the like older generation that we interviewed, they were kind of at the mercy of the situation around them, in the sense that like they didn't really have the freedom or the mobility to kind of go to other states and find work that they were interested in. A lot of them worked at the grocery store because that was the only choice available to them. Their parents started grocery stores, and like when you're in that family situation as a kid, you're expected to help out. The moment you can start doing some math, like you're behind the register, like giving change to the customers. So I think like that was kind of like a big realization that I had, which is that people kind of take on roles that are available to them in their environment. A lot of them, and that's not to say they stay in that environment forever. I think there is an interesting difference between the younger generation that's kind of a lot of them moving away from the South, or at least moving away from more rural areas to bigger cities in Texas or like Memphis or Jackson, where it's just a bigger city and there are more opportunities available to them. But for the people that stick around in the South, there is something that really kind of draws them back in. For instance, one of the guys that we interviewed, his name is Taylor. He's 24 years old, and he identifies as this like fourth generation farmer. And for him, he can't imagine doing anything else. And I think that's because he has just kind of developed this sense of pride that his family has been doing the same thing, and they're really good at it. And so for him, it's like there's no reason to leave the South when that's the life he knows, and that's the life that he really cares about. And yeah, I think that's a big difference, which is that like once these people kind of like feel like that place is home, like the South, the rural South is their home, there really isn't a motivation to leave for anything else. I think there are a lot of people, even in the older generation, where they've sort of made it in life. They're slightly wealthier, they have nice homes and stuff, but they don't really want to move because they have so many like great memories of growing up in the South, and they just really see that place as home, which I think like maybe to us would be slightly surprising. Maybe to us we would think that like, as Asian Americans, maybe if you're in the minority, you would want to be with other people who are like you in a bigger city.
And that's kind of a thing that comes up, doesn't it? Like this theme that Asians only kind of stick to themselves, like that we're insular. But one thing I noticed listening to some of the stories on the website is that some of them actually coped with racism and those other problems they encountered by removing themselves from it. So do you think, in a way, the rural Chinese and like the urban Chinese kind of adapt in a similar way? Like not a good or bad thing. They just remove themselves from the problem. I just want to hear your thoughts on that.
I think as Asian Americans, I think that's a kind of good generalization. But I think relative to the context that you're in, I think if you're in a large urban city like San Francisco, Los Angeles, or New York, you are not as likely to kind of be exposed to that very blatant almost racism and discrimination now. I think because now it's the racism piece has been such a hot topic in society today that I think if it is brought up, it's something that is reprimanded by teachers, by parents in those large urban cities. And it's an issue that people are very attentive to versus I think in the South, I think Asian Americans and Chinese Americans specifically are still objected to very kind of blatant racism. And just kind of hearing the stories of one of the people that we spoke to, Ryan Kwan, basically him saying that, he was bullied and physically and emotionally, and he would go up to teachers. He'd, hear other parents talking about the situations and downplaying everything. And so being in that different context too, I think is unique as a Chinese Americans in the South where, they're almost very used to being called a chink, or they're being used to called Bruce Lee or Chinaman in a very derogatory way. But at the same time, a lot of the Chinese Americans still are like, okay, well, if you don't want me here, I'm just not going to be here. I don't want to subject myself to any of this tension. And so some of the themes and the stories that we heard from some of the older generations were basically that, it's fine. If you don't want me here, I still have a whole community that I can go back to for my family, to my grocery store. I don't really have time to think about if I'm fitting in or being included because after school, I have to go back to my grocery store, help my parents, because if I don't, they're going to whip me. They're going to give me a spanking. And so they had basically their entire life almost structured around them where they didn't have the room to kind of piece together like, oh, I'm being excluded, oh, like this or that, because they were already part of a very tightly knit community, whether it be their family or relatives.
So seeing now, what with the way the world is right now in the States and elsewhere, race has always been a kind of a hot button issue, but the discussion about it has kind of come back in in a new way. And I think this is kind of the case for Asian Americans too. So I want to ask you guys, do you think that for this next generation of Asian Americans, is there a renewed interest in the history?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Andrew, go ahead.
Oh, no, go for it. I'll add on.
Okay. I think it's interesting. It's an interesting kind of development for Asian Americans. I think there's, I've noticed at least from watching shows and kind of listening to other people talk about their journey through kind of embracing their Asian American identity. I think a lot of kids start out trying not to be associated with other Asian Americans because then they'll be typecast, they'll be discriminated against. Classic example being if you bring weird smelling food to school, then people are going to be like, what are you eating? That's something that has a very strong impact for you as an Asian American when you're young. And then I think over time, as you get older, once you care less about what people think about your race and your identity, then I think you begin to kind of appreciate more your roots and your culture. And I think this is something that is pretty common, I think, in a lot of my friends. As we're getting older, I think we're trying to understand ourselves more by kind of going back to our roots. And I think I think it really depends on time and place. It depends where you live. I think places like New York, SF, LA, where there are other Asian Americans, it's very easy to embrace it. It's very easy to embrace your identity because there are so many other people like you. I'm not entirely sure what that experience is like if you're living in the South. For the Chinese American community in the South, I think it helped that there were a lot of people like them in that area when they were growing up. So a lot of our subjects, I think, had other people to lean on to. But I can easily imagine Asian Americans in other parts of the rural South where maybe they didn't have that community. And for them, it's harder to embrace their roots because then that means sticking out. That means being treated differently. So I think that does get pretty complicated. It depends on where you live. It depends on the era that you grew up in. But I think for the most part, there seems to be this current where a lot of Asian Americans are just more open about their identity. And I think with other kind of like racial justice movements or just kind of people talking more about racial matters, I think people feel more comfortable to engage in that. And I think just having more kind of vocal voices will only help Asian Americans in general to kind of, I guess, talk about it and to almost embrace it.
Yeah, and I think that was kind of one of our goals of this project as well, is to almost bring together a audiovisual experience for someone either in the South or someone in large urban cities to have something tangible that they can see that almost triggers them perhaps to think more on their identity, to think more on their roots, or to even think more about when their family came here, why their family came here, and kind of understanding more of their family history. And I think it's something that's very easy to trigger when you see a bunch of images and you hear some audio and you hear some quotes about basically this other subculture of Chinese Americans living in the South. I think it forces you as an Asian American in a larger city to be like, wow, like these guys have such a strong sense of community and tradition and history. As an Asian American in a large urban city, it's easy to kind of forget that when you're surrounded by a lot of diversity. So I think our goal almost for this project is to bring that kind of level of awareness to people in kind of larger urban cities, and also in kind of southern environments or environments and communities where Asians aren't as prevalent.
For sure. I guess it's all about perspective, isn't it? I remember like when I was visiting like my family back home, like of all places to visit, I visited the museum, and there was like an exhibit on Chinese Canadians in prairie towns and stuff. I saw a lot of parallels, like, between these, like, these tight-knit communities who basically they're still othered, they're still discriminated against, but they still, they still contribute. Like they're not, like they're still serving in the army. I just think, like, if only, like, more people saw us, like more people in the city, and you see, like, I guess how big the network is, how rich that history is. Maybe my impression was a lot of the millennial, like, Asian Americans and millennial Chinese now, a little more, I don't know, every time it seemed like you'd bring these matters up, they'd always, like, kind of be a bit dismissive of it. Yeah, so, like, it seemed like they were less open to talk about it, but I think projects like this will definitely go a long way in just showing people, an alternative perspective.
Yeah, I think actually people are more open now than ever for stories like this. I think it just helps that like the Chinese community in the Delta have like such a rich history and such a strong presence. And also I think it's also the combination of seeing like this Chinese face in a very rural South landscape that is almost like kind of, it surprises you. Like you don't think that's normal. But I think it's just kind of telling their stories and really emphasizing the fact that like these Chinese people have been there forever. They're about as American as anyone else. They've made huge contributions to their towns, to their cities. One of them even worked at NASA and was, kind of a part of sending someone to the moon. Like that's a big deal. And I think like if more millennial Asian Americans kind of realize that, then they'll realize that they have something to be proud of. And yeah, I think it helps that like we have a lot more sort of role models these days, like even like famous people who are Asian, and that gives people something to kind of latch onto, to be more interested in their identity, to be more interested in how Asians are represented in the media, and I believe like that's a really big part of it. The more times you see an Asian American on TV, or like the more you read about stuff like this, it makes you proud to be who you are. And when you reach that point, then you're kind of like more confident to do different things. You're more confident about just your status as like an Asian American in this country.
Absolutely agree. And with that said, and this is going to be my last question here, after finishing a project of this magnitude, are you guys inspired to do more in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely. I think we were just reflecting on like 2017, and for me, working on the Delta Chinese project was one of the most fun and most fulfilling projects that I did. Part of it being that we had complete creative control from start to finish. We did it because we cared about the topic, and along the way we met some really interesting people, and like we feel more connected to them. So yeah, I think having completed this project makes me want to like focus on other diaspora communities, not just in the States but around the world. As a Korean, I'm very interested in the Korean diaspora all across the world. There are some really interesting groups, for instance, in Russia and Central Asia that I don't think have received a lot of coverage. That is something that I'm fairly interested in at the moment. But yeah, I think once you finish a project of this magnitude, it really gives you a lot of confidence. It makes you think that you can tackle even more projects. And I think just realizing that commercial photography will only fulfill you to a certain extent. And then to really experience true happiness, you have to kind of go beyond that and really meet people and try to tell their stories. So yeah, hopefully we'll have more projects in the pipeline.
And for myself, I think this definitely inspired kind of a wave of more kind of documentary type photography. I think not only when it comes to race, I think I would love to go into more like rural China, kind of going into more of my roots, my family's roots, and tapping into certain sub-communities or subcultures. But not only that, but I think subcultures in general within the United States, I think would be a super interesting area to tap into, whether it be more race or ethnicity based, or even when it comes to like being rooted in sport subcultures. I think the sports realm is something that I'm very interested in, and maybe tapping into different areas in the US and documenting some of those stories. I think this kind of project gave me the confidence from seeing how a piece starts from a broad vision and idea to, kind of finishing that, wrapping it up, filtering all the selects and the images and actually distributing it out to people. Seeing that whole process was definitely an invaluable one for me. So I definitely can see myself doing more kind of documentary type photography.
Awesome. Well, guys, it has been an absolute pleasure. For those of you listening in that want to check out their website, you can find it at www.thedeltachinese.com. Thanks again, guys.
Awesome. Thanks, Nathan.
Cool. Thanks for having us.
Anytime. Take care now. If you'd like to hear more stories like this one and more from the world of creative culture and beyond, check them out at maekan.com. That's MAEKAN.com. Or search for us on your favorite podcast app.